If there's one thing railways are good at, it's moving materials in bulk. Not just long distance, but short distance as well. Many mines, quarries, and factories found railways to be an ideal way of moving things around a site, especially large or heavy goods like blocks of stone or machine parts. One of Ireland's most notable industrial railways, however, wasn't built to move stone, coal, or steel, but beer. Founded in 1759 by Arthur Guinness, the St James's Gate Brewery in Dublin produced stout beer for the people of Ireland. Guinness's beer proved to be very popular, not just in Ireland but in Britain too, beating out most of its competitors and becoming one of the most dominant breweries in the world. This success, however, came at a price. The original 4-acre brewery was unable to keep up with demand, and so the site was expanded out to 50 acres. But this led to further issues moving all the raw ingredients, brewing waste and barrels around the even bigger site. Horse tramways and horses and carts were initially used, but were found to be slow and unreliable. By 1873, the brewery was producing close to 750,000 barrels of Guinness a year, with demand only increasing. Something had to be done to keep the beer flowing, and with the site being so big, it was proposed the brewery build a rail system all throughout the facility to move supplies internally. Supervising engineer Samuel Gagan settled on 22-inch narrow-gauge track and specified that the rolling stock would have a maximum height of 6 foot, width of 5 foot, and no gradient on the line would be greater than 1 in 40. All the wagons used on the line would be custom built to fit within the loading gauge. Work began on laying the rails, but Gagan soon faced another problem. The newly built brewery facilities that were closer to the River Liffey were also 50 feet lower down from the main site. Initially, his solution was to install a hydraulic lift to connect the two, but its limited size meant it was only able to lift one wagon at a time, which was not only slow, but meant breaking up and reassembling trains. Realising how time-consuming the lift was, Gagan instead had a tunnel built under St James's Street to connect the two sites, installing a spiralling track in the old brewery which went down 35 feet. Once the line was done, 8 miles of narrow-gauge track had been laid throughout the brewery, which not only connected the entire site, but also ran along the quay by the river and a canal harbour next to the brewery to help load and unload barges with supplies and beer. Naturally, a railway needs engines to run it, and so the brewery bought an 040 tank engine from Sharp Stewart & Company in 1875, being numbered 1. The engine, however, proved to not only be underpowered, but was also difficult to maintain. As such, number 1 was quickly put to one side once the brewery got hold of 2 more powerful engines a year later. Number 2, hops, and number 3, malt, were much better performers than number 1, but they too were found to be maintenance heavy and were known to damage rails as they ran on them. Another 2 engines were ordered from Sharp Stewart in 1878, but it was found dirt could easily enter their moving parts, again meaning more maintenance. Fed up of all these inadequate engines, Gagan ended up designing his own locomotives to work in the brewery. His design was an 040 side tank engine with the cylinders mounted on top of the boiler, and a vertical connecting rod connecting the cylinders to the wheels. The engine's frames spanned the full height of the locomotive, with the cylinders and tanks being fixed to the frames rather than the boiler. By removing the pins and connecting rods, the engine could be easily lifted from its spring frames to make maintenance much easier, and the cylinders had casings over them to prevent dirt from clogging them up. A locomotive using Gagan's design was ordered from Avonside and arrived in 1882, numbered 6. The design proved to be successful, so the brewery ordered another 3 engines 5 years later from a local engine builder, William Spence. Anytime the brewery was in need of more motive power, another batch of Gagen's engines were ordered from Spence. By 1921, 19 of these engines were operating the line. The narrow gauge engines, however, didn't just work inside the brewery, but sometimes took short trips outside too. Shortly after the narrow gauge line was completed, a tramway was built from the site to Kingsbridge Station, now known as Houston Station, which was just around the corner. The line was built to Irish standard gauge, 5 foot 3 inches, totaling 2 miles in length, including the tracks in the yard around the brewery. The job of this line was to connect Guinness to Ireland's rail system to help bring supplies in and take beer out. Horses were initially used on this line, but when the time came to get a locomotive, Gagen felt that rather than buy another engine to shunt on the line, he could instead use one of the many narrow gauge engines at his disposal. And so he had 4 custom haulage wagons built as a means of allowing the narrow gauge locomotives to run on the broad gauge track. These were essentially frames the locomotive could be lowered into. The narrow and broad gauge rails were interlaced over each other, and a hydraulic hoist would lift the locomotive up so a frame could be rolled beneath it. Once in place, the engine's wheels would contact a set of rollers, geared at a 3:1 ratio, which would in turn power the haulage wagon's wheels. And just like that, you have a broad gauge engine. Despite their size, these engines were quite powerful and hard-working. On average, one engine alone would be able to move 8,000 casks a day, and when in a haulage wagon, were able to move 13 fully loaded broad gauge wagons at once. All the same, by 1912, the brewery decided to get a proper locomotive for their tramway, and bought a 4-cylinder petrol locomotive. The engine turned out to be quite unreliable, and so 2 steam tank engines were ordered from Hudswell Clark shortly afterwards. The first arrived in 1914, but the second wasn't completed until 1919 due to the First World War. Each numbered 2 and 3 respectively. Both followed the standard Hudswell Clark design, but with 3 major changes. They were regauged to run on Irish rails, had their wheels and motion covered for public safety, and were equipped with a bell to warn pedestrians while moving. The bell was connected to the engine's motion, and so would ring automatically as the engine moved, with the driver capable of enabling and disabling it when needed. The bells, however, were quickly removed. Firstly, because the engines never moved faster than walking pace while on the road with a flagman walking out in front for safety anyway, and secondly was due to the amount of complaints the brewery received from patients at a nearby hospital. Both of these lines and all the engines allowed the brewery to run like clockwork, but by the 1940s the steam engines were starting to become uneconomical to run, and so the brewery decided to pursue diesel alternatives instead. In 1947, a 37 horsepower diesel was built for the brewery, and after a successful trial, another 11 were helping work the site by 1950, with a broad gauge diesel also being brought in to serve the tramway in 1949. Both lines continued to serve the brewery and moved an impressive amount of beer, until 1965. By this point, Dublin was looking to widen the road the tramway travelled along, which meant pulling up the line and relaying it. With road lorries now able to do the same work with less hassle, Guinness saw no point in relaying the tracks, and so the tramway was finally closed on the 15th of May 1965. At the same time, parts of the narrow gauge line running throughout the brewery were already out of use, with many other parts seeing less traffic. By 1975, Guinness was using much more modern equipment throughout the brewery, and so the narrow gauge line was deemed no longer necessary and removed, though by this point most of it had fallen out of use anyway. Guinness sold most of their rolling stock for scrap, but kept 1 Gagen tank and 1 diesel engine for display purposes. 4 more of Gagen's tank engines have been preserved by enthusiasts, along with many of the diesels and engine number 3 which was used on the tramway. Not much of either of the original railways remain, apart from a few rails that are still set in the ground at the St James's Gate Brewery. In the end, though Guinness certainly wasn't the first major brewery to build its own railway, nor the biggest, you can't deny that that it absolutely held a unique appeal of its own, and had its own fair share of curiosities. A bunch of small tank engines might not quite be as whimsical as a load of little orange men running around singing about chocolate, but in my book, I'd say it was just as good. Subscribe for more.